This lesson we're going to be taking some HTML code, a JSON file, bringing the contents of the JSON file, which will load into the slider and then allow us to navigate through the contents of the file as it's being output and created as page elements. This is all going to be done with JavaScript. We're also going to be focusing on how we can navigate through to the different elements, so traversing through the elements using JavaScript. Got an HTML file with some styling, and then we're going to be applying all of the slides using JavaScript, connecting to the JSON data file. So this is where we've got some data that we want to output within the slide. We want to load this content whenever the page content has loaded. So let's select the main page element, and that's going to be adding the content into the slider, the element with the class of slider. So I'm going to select that as an object, and using the document query selector, select the element with a class of slider, and we also want to make sure that the page has loaded. So on the window object, add event listener, and the event that we're going to be listening for is DOM content loaded. And whenever DOM content loaded runs, then we're going to run the function called init. Let's create the function, so init. And for now, we're just going to output into the console the word ready, so that we know that we're ready to continue building the application. We're going to make our connection to the JSON data and then load that into the slides. So right now we are ready, and we can select using fetch to the file, and this is just app5JSON. And on the return of the response, we can get the response object and then return that as JSON data using the JSON method. And then lastly, we should have it as data, and then we can make use of the data within the JavaScript code. So for now, we'll log it out into the console once we retrieve the data. And it looks like there was a problem there. So that was just a misspelling of the word response. So now that we loaded the data, we're ready to create the slides and add them into the slider object that we've selected with the JavaScript code. We can create a separate function, and I'll call this adder. So this will run whenever the data has loaded. We'll pass it in as data. Can comment out the console messages. And now it's passing the data once it does have the JSON object as a response and sending it over to adder. So this is where we can create the slide elements for the page, and we're going to be adding it to the slider object. So let's loop through the data and using for each, and this is each item within the data. You can also get the index value as well, and return that back within the loop. And this is where we want to create the page elements. So let's create the main slide using the document and create element. The element type that we're creating is going to be a div. And for the slide, using the class list, let's add a class. And the class that we're going to be adding is going to be slide, so that we can easily identify it, and that will apply the slide properties to it. We're going to append it to the slider, so slider append slide, so it will add the newly created slide to the page. Let's just make sure that we do have it. So go into the elements, the HTML, and in the body of main, and within the slider, there's our 3 slides that we've created. We haven't added any content yet, so that's why we don't see anything there yet. So let's take a look at what we have for content. So we'd have a title for the slide. So I want to create another element within the slide, and this is going to be the title. And using the document create element, and we'll create this one as an H2 element. And then the title is going to have a text content, and this is coming from the JSON file, and this is going to be contained within item title. And then we're going to append the title to the slide. So slide append title. So we'll add the title in there. So that will add in those title elements using the h2 tag. So there's the slide 2, slide 3, and so on. The reason we can't see it is because we've got a black background, and I'll update the color for now to be white so that we can see the slide values. So now those are added to the page, and right now we do also have the slide at opacity 0. So if we remove out the opacity 0, we should get the third slide object. And they're all being added within the same spot. So as we're adding them to the page. Let's add the rest of the properties to it. So the text content is coming from the item title. We can apply some styling properties to it as well. So title, style, and set the text align so that we can center the text. And of course, you can do this with CSS as well. So we're adding the style. If it's the first slide, then we're going to add in active class to it, and the active class will actually show. So change the opacity to 1. So let's have a condition, and if index is equal to 0, that means that this is going to be the first slide. So for the slide, using class list add, we're going to add the active class to it. So that will show slide 1 or whatever the first slide content is here. So we have some HTML content as well within the slide. So let's add that in within the slide content. And I'll create a div, and this div is where we're going to have our HTML content. So using the document, we're going to create another element, and the element that we're creating is going to be a div. And within this div, the inner HTML is going to get the value from the item. And this is from the item content from the JSON file. So we've just got it as an object property of HTML. And we also want to append the div to the page. So we want to append the title first, and then append the div, which is going to contain all of the HTML for the slide. So there's our HTML for the slide. We also have a property of a background color and a font color. So let's add that to the slide. So style and background color. And this is coming from the item back. And then also slide style color, and this is coming from the font color that we want to use. And that's just under the property name of color. So there's our slide, and now if we update the color here, it's going to also update to whatever we're displaying as the color. And that's just showing the first slide with the contents of the slide as HTML content. So we want to make the slide interactive, and we want to enable the buttons to be clicked. So let's add in the click events for the buttons. We want to select both of the buttons on the page. They both have a class of button, and then they also have a previous and next. So let's go ahead and select them by the buttons. And then in case we have more buttons, using the document and query selector all, we're going to select all the elements with class of button and need to prefix it with a dot. So that will give us a selection of all of the button elements. And so what we want to do is we want to add event listeners to those buttons. And we can do that by looping through. So we can also select each individual button. So this is just going to be returning back the button object. And then for the button on click, we can run a function. And I'm just going to do this as an anonymous function within the for each. So as we're looping through the buttons, we're adding click events to the buttons. And within the console log, we'll just write clicked for now. And then we need a way to distinguish between the buttons. So when we click the button over to the console, we'll clear that, and we see that it's been clicked. So we want to check to see if a class is contained within the element, and we can do that using the class list contains. And this is a way to check if a class exists within a particular class property. It will return true if the class is there. So let's check to see which button got clicked. And of course you could select them separately, but we do want to practice some more JavaScript. So let's add that in where we're selecting the element, which is going to be the button, and then use the class list and contains. And if the class that it contains is going to be previous, then we know that we've got a hit on the previous button. And otherwise, or we could do a separate function to check to see if it contains next. So that will select it out as next. So create a function in order to handle that. And this is going to be our mover function. So this is going to move from slide to slide and selecting the element that's going to be the one that's going to be set to be active. So as the mover, we're going to take in just the one parameter, and that will just be the direction that we're moving. So for the contains previous, we can type in previous here within the mover. And under the next, we'll type in next under the mover. So that way we're able to select we know which direction we want to move. And we can also turn this into a Boolean as well. So this one can just be false, and this can be true. So we know that the true is going to increment it. So let's do a condition where we're going to check the direction. And if it's true, then we're moving it over to the next. Otherwise, we're moving it over to the previous one. So we want to be able to select out which elements we currently have the active class on. So let's select the elements, and we can use that using the document and query selector, selecting the element with a class of active. And this is going to be whatever current element currently has the class of active. We want to remove it from that current element and then apply it to whatever the next element is that we want to use. So for the current, and then using class list, remove the class of active. So that will remove out whatever the current one is that is active. And this one we can actually do a ternary operator depending on the condition. And this is going to be whatever the new active element is going to be. So depending on what the condition is, we want to select either the element before or the element after to apply the new active to. So let's select those into values. So the next element and then the previous element. And using whatever the current element is, we can navigate through the DOM using the next element sibling, and this will return back the next element sibling. And if we're at the end, we want to simply return back the first element. And that's going to be coming from the slider and getting the first child, first element child. And for the next element, we can select for the current one and get the previous element sibling. So that will provide us the element that's just prior to the one that we're currently on as active. And if there isn't one, then if it returns back null, then we're just going to get the last. So this is going to be selecting whatever the element is, so either the next or the previous. So the new active element is going to be either the next element, if it's true, or it's going to be the previous element if it's false. And that allows us to get the new active, and using the class list, we can add the active class to it. So now when we click it, we're able to cycle through all of the page elements. And we can always go previous and next, and that will show each element there that's coming from the JSON file. And we're able to interact and click on them. You can also update some of the styling for the elements. So set the cursor to pointer as we hover over them. So that'll make it a little bit more clickable. Also for the button hover, let's set the background color to just be solid black. So we don't need to use RGB, we'll just use RGB. So that means that whenever we're hovering over them, they're going to be a little bit easier to see. So that's how we can use the JavaScript in order to build a slider and traverse through the different elements that are available. So this is dynamically created and using the content from the JSON file. So that means that if we were to add in additional items into the JSON file, that would just automatically just work. So we can add in as many items as we want as long as we're keeping the same structure from the JSON file. Matter to the application how many items there are, because there's always going to be a next element, a previous element, or a first and a last child. So that's a way that we can navigate through those elements. So before wrapping up, there's also a way to simplify some of the code. So if you go up to the top where we're sending in either the Boolean value of true or false, we can just simply send it over to mover and have the Boolean value whether it contains this particular class of next. And that allows us to remove out some lines of code and still get the same functionality where we can move through the slides by selecting and clicking on it, and this is just passing in the Boolean value into the mover function, which we're picking up and then using to determine which is the current element and which direction we want to move the elements in.